This is Reverend Otis Moss III here at Trinity United Church of Christ, and you are watching Empowering Voices. This is Pastor Otis Moss III here in Chicago, Illinois at Trinity United Church of Christ, saying to each and every person who is watching, listening to Empowering Voices, hands up. Once again, a gentleman of African descent by the name of Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. Once again, we witnessed the militarization of the police force that has been happening over the last 40 years as a result of the war on drugs. Once again, we are witnessing unprecedented response by the people, but yet in the media, we see a second killing of Michael Brown, being blamed for what happened to him. An unarmed young man who this day would be starting school, beginning a new life in terms of college. But it is beyond that. It is the fact that for every man of color, every black man, that you walk into a space and you first have to deal with the fractured psychology and the broken sociology in our community. What does that mean, this fractured psychology? Is that ever since the releasing of, quote-unquote, emancipated people of African descent, there has been a concerted effort in America to view and to frame people of color as criminals. A tremendous writer by the name of Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who is the director of the Schomburg Institute in New York, has written a tremendous book, his dissertation, The Condemnation of Blackness, where he talks about the criminalization of black men and black women. During the antebellum period, that's before the Civil War, black people were viewed in a particular way, but were not viewed in the criminalized way as we are after the emancipation. And so the entire Michael Brown saga, the Trayvon Martin saga, is a part of a long history of viewing people of color as a threat. Now, there are those who are conservative out there that will make the statement that this is deserving of people of color. Well, if one were to look from 1863 to roughly 1938, what you will notice is there was in place known as vagrancy laws. These vagrancy laws during Reconstruction were put in place because black men and black women were highly skilled. The entire South was built by people of African descent. Whether you were looking at Charleston, South Carolina, Birmingham, Alabama, or Atlanta, Georgia, it was black labor. But not unskilled labor, highly skilled, creative, ingenuity, and engineering. Whether you're talking about a front porch, the design of a home, blacksmith, the utilization of materials, whether it's copper or metal or silver or gold, the kind of ingenuity that was used in the South came from not only black hands, but black minds. In 1863, after emancipation and black people, 4 million of them moved into other areas of the United States. Highly skilled labor of Africans and unskilled immigrant labor was crashing, was colliding, and therefore black people had to be framed as a criminal. And vagrancy laws were put in place throughout the South. Black men were placed in jail into a peonage system. Through these laws, 100,000 people placed in peonage. What does that mean? That's what we call sharecropping, where 2 or 3 people are gathered in the South. You could be picked up and placed in jail if you did not have your papers. When criminologists in places like Harvard and University of Chicago decided to do studies on people of color, they said, well, the arrest rate is so high for people of color. Well, the laws, the policies that were in place created this higher level of people of color being arrested. But these people began to write to say that there was a proclivity for crime of people of color. They are a threat. It also protected what was known during the Prohibition era, what was called speakeasies. Speakeasies, juke joints, where you could get illicit alcohol in places, whether you were in Harlem or you were in Manhattan, or if you lived in someplace in New Jersey or on the boardwalk, for those of you who watch Boardwalk Empire, all throughout the United States. These speakeasies were usually on the border of African American communities. But in order for these speakeasies to operate and to seem as if they were in line with some of the laws that were happening, they put them on the border of areas of people of color. And then the police would come in and not arrest the people in the speakeasy, but would arrest the people who lived around these juke joints. These places were not owned by African Americans. These places were not visited by African Americans. But then it created a higher statistic rate of the incarceration of black men. In order to keep the alcohol flowing, black men were used again as the scapegoat, as were black women. Most of these juke joints were owned by people who were not in the African American community, but again, it benefited this community to use black people as a scapegoat and say they were a threat. And so the sharecropping system became the standard bearer in the South. Work off your debt. In other words, you are re-enslaved. There's a wonderful book called Slavery by Another Name. I believe it won the Pulitzer Prize. It was created into a PBS documentary. If you want more information about the peonage system known as sharecropping, I'm the grandson of a sharecropper. Otis Moss Sr. was a sharecropper. My father escaped sharecropping and was able to receive an education at Morehouse. It was a form of slavery. If you did not pay your debt, you could be placed in jail, and then your labor was then sold to a company like U.S. Steel would purchase black men and women who had been incarcerated because of vagrancy or they did not pay their debts of sharecropping. But you must remember now, many of these people could not read or write, and they were taken advantage of in order for larger corporations to make money. Then you have the war on drugs when Nixon becomes president. And the war on drugs was not a war on drugs, it was a war on people of color, where they were not looking at the drug lords who were bringing drugs here, but low-level drug offenders. It was a public health crisis, but we framed it as an issue of public safety and attacked mostly black and brown people. And so even though crime statistics were going down, as Michelle Alexander talks about in her book, The New Jim Crow, the incarceration rate was going up. Currently now in the United States, almost 1/3 of those who are citizens in the United States, this is an interesting statistic that was recently on NPR, 1/3 of the citizens have had some type of arrest, not conviction, but an arrest. So every time we put a little box, have you been arrested, we are actually discriminating against 1/3 of the population. I give that analysis to say that the psychology in America is fractured because it views every person of color as a potential threat. And it creates a sociology that is broken, where groups of people then say black people are a threat. Then we raise the question of black on black crime. Well, wait a minute. I recently went to the FBI, a website, looking at crime all across the board. And the majority of crimes are committed by people of European descent. But we've never had a conversation to say white on white crime. And if you go down different crime categories, there are about 50 of them. The majority of those crime categories are not by men of color. But we define it as black on black to say that there is something culturally or genetically wrong with people of color. Demented psychology, fractured sociology, because we have a non-existent theology. And so I say to those of you who are watching and listening today that we need a theology that changes our psychology, that will shift the sociology. Keep your hands up. Let's create a theology that changes the psychology and the sociology of those living in America. I'm Otis Moss III, pastor here at Trinity United Church of Christ, and we're going to keep our hands up. God bless.